Tonight, we take a close look at the Ebola outbreak, which is spreading quickly in West Africa as government officials in the U.S. and abroad are scrambling here, trying to boost measures to keep the virus under control. A Texas nurse who contracted the disease and her dog both under quarantine. Tonight, Dr. Richard Klein will join us in studio to tell us what the process involves. And we'll dive into the race for the U.S. Senate. Who will control the Senate? Election day just 3 weeks away, and candidates across the country making those final pitches. The GOP right now looks like the favorite. What can the Dems do, if anything, to close the gap? Plus, a look at Alzheimer's disease like you've never seen or heard it before. We will speak with author Greg O'Brien about his new book and his own battle in a very honest and a raw interview as he discusses the debilitating disease. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I am Richard French and thank you so much for joining us. Tonight we're going to take a look at the Ebola outbreak. The World Health Organization says West Africa could face up to 10,000 new cases of the virus per week, and that could happen within the next 2 months. Health agency also says the death rate in the current outbreak, it has spiked. 70% of those who contract the virus, they die from it. Look at this graphic. It shows where the number of deaths stood in West Africa as of September 5th compared to where they stand this month. In Guinea, 517 people died from Ebola in September, and as of October 8th, that number, it has rose to 778. Sierra Leone, 491 people died in September compared to 930 as of October 8th. Liberia saw just under 2,000 deaths in September and more than 2,300 this month. And in Nigeria, 8 people died in September, and as of October 8th, that number remains unchanged. But you should all know, those stats that I gave you, they are on the low side. Many people think the number even increased. Woman on your screen, however, is in the States. CDC is trying to determine how 26-year-old Nina Pham, a nurse in Dallas, got infected while caring for Thomas Eric Duncan, who died just last week. Authorities say she was wearing a mask, shield, and gloves while treating Duncan. She, the first person to contract the virus on U.S. soil without ever leaving the country. Pham received a blood transfusion from Dr. Kent Brantley, who recently survived Ebola. Pham released a statement today saying she is doing well. She and her dog are under quarantine. In Germany, a UN worker who was infected with Ebola in Liberia, he died overnight. White House, they, for their part, reassuring Americans the risk of Ebola spreading in the U.S. is incredibly low. Earlier today, I spoke with Dr. Richard Klein, who's a practicing physician in Yorktown Heights, specializing in internal medicine and infectious diseases. He's also the associate professor of medicine at New York Medical College and was knighted by the Italian government when it comes to humanitarian work. Doctor, again, thank you very much for joining us. And I'm curious, will you be teaching in class? This is not how to handle an infectious disease with what we've learned on how the case was handled in Dallas.
Yes. One of the points is really upsetting. They sent this man home with 103 fever, and that's something one doesn't do in any hospital.
We've heard from Dr. Fauci and others that we're going to need to re-examine protocols right now. Do you think it's much more systemic, potentially, the problem in dealing with something like Ebola, not just by what was mishandled in Texas, but there are protocols altogether are flawed, and maybe we should only be sending patients that have Ebola to maybe a handful of hospitals in the country that are really equipped to handle them?
Well, it's interesting that I was here a week ago and we had one person sick with Ebola in the United States. The whole country is really upset, fearing that we're going to have an epidemic, and a week later we still have one person sick with Ebola in the United States. People just don't realize that 50,000 people, as I mentioned last week, die of the flu once a week.
I hear you, doctor, but then there comes, and I got to tell you, any issue when I'm out of here that people want to talk about, and last week it has been this subject. When we do look at what is happening in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and I know that's not the United States, but on how the rapidity at which this thing has spread.
Yes.
And the questions about how it's been handled even here, and the concerns that, and you're an infectious disease expert, and you were the guy in charge in Westchester of quarantining back in the day. Is there a legitimate concern that If this thing gets mishandled along the way, then if 1 becomes 2 and 2 becomes 4 and 4 becomes 8, then this isn't just a problem that we can say is isolated here, but it could get out ahead of us.
I don't believe that's going to happen. There are many reasons why we have the problem in Western Africa. The fact is that the World Health Organization didn't tell us how serious it was, although we knew that there was an epidemic going on in March of this year. The people that work for the WHO, they were political appointees. They had no medical experience. The WHO has been underfunded by our Congress, the Republican side of our Congress. The CDC has been underfunded by the Republican side. So the problems that we have in Africa, there are so many people sick that they can't handle them. The clinics some of the clinics don't have water. They don't have protective gear, and they don't have the treatment that we have, which is just plain IV fluids. So if you get there is a rapidity of people getting sick over there, and the reports are today that if we don't do something about it, next month it'll be 10,000, perhaps 10,000 a week.
But why are you confident that the problem, albeit potentially exponentially bad in Africa, stays in Africa and doesn't come here?
Well, I said last week we're going to get cases here. We're not going to get an epidemic. It's not going to be a pandemic from Africa to the United States. We're going to get sporadic cases, and unfortunately the person's going to go into the hospital and expose the medical personnel before they recognize what's going on. So the people who really are going to get into trouble are not the average citizen, but medical personnel.
There was a comment from an official over at NIH that if they had more funding, they'd have a vaccine by now. Do you think that's true?
Possibly, yes.
How does money play into this?
You need money for whatever they pay for at the CDC, and some of it has to be taken from one department to another. I don't think Ebola was not on our minds. Some companies were trying to make some serum or some treatment. It's the WHO in Africa that was supposed to be in charge of getting people to do the vaccine. They haven't done it.
We sit down here a month from now, where do you think this thing is?
We're going to have everybody still frightened. We're going to have maybe a dozen cases of Ebola. I don't think more than a couple of dozen.
In the States, and how about in Africa? How bad does it get?
It's going to get much worse before it gets better, because the infrastructure has to be. You know, the other thing is, if it continues at this high rate, there may be such pandemony that governments would be overrun, and that there will be no leadership over there at all. It's a very scary thought that if the police don't do anything about it, and the military may be fearful of doing. I mean, the governments can just collapse, and that is something that is very serious. But that's not a medical issue; that's political.
Doctor, thank you as always. I really do appreciate a few minutes.
Thank you.
Now, when we come back, everyone, we're going to bring in our roundtable and talk about this issue as well. Stay with us. RFL continues right after this.